Here we go. Okay. Hi, Luke. Hi, Norman. Hi, Stuart. Thank you for joining me here today on Vonvo.com. It is January 5th. My name's Max Ringelheim, and I'm the founder of Vonvo.com, co-founder. I wanted to inform you quickly today that this conversation is being recorded, and that once the discussion is over, we will be posting it to our Vonvo YouTube channel. Luke, is that okay with you? And we'll just go down the line.
Yep, that's fine with me.
Norman, is that fine with you?
Yes, sir.
And Stuart?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. Okay, and then just lastly, since we have a full panel here today, in terms of the rules of Vonvo, we don't want there to be any personal attacks, no insults or racist remarks, and we just want to keep the conversation civil and valuable. Is that okay with each of you?
That's fine. Yes. Yep.
Okay, great. So let's jump right into the discussion about Israel and Palestine. We're going to obviously have we're going to put a South Africa twist on this conversation, since all three of you have ties and have lived, grew up in South Africa, and we're going to compare the current situation in Israel to that. Stuart, would you mind just giving any of our audience and viewers just a quick introduction into yourself, and then we'll go with Norman and then Luke.
Hi, yeah, my name's Stuart, obviously. I've been involved in South Africa for well over 20 years now. That involvement began when I was recruited by the ANC for some secret operations inside South Africa back in the 1980s, in the mid-1980s. So I saw apartheid when it was up and running, and I was very active in trying to do whatever I could to bring it to an end. I've seen South Africa since then. I regularly visit South Africa now. I work for a charity supporting a charity in South Africa from the UK.
Great. Norman, how about yourself?
Certainly. Let me just say to begin with, just to get it in context, which period of time was Stuart in South Africa?
Yeah, from the mid-1980s up until about 1991, and then I went back there a couple of times, 2000, 2003, and now I go back there on a regular basis. I spent about 4 or 5 months last year in South Africa.
Okay, thanks. I was born in Cape Town in South Africa and left in 1946 and left in 1987 with my family. I live in the United States now, and I've been going back and forth to South Africa over a number of years, so I know something. I know something about pre-1994, when apartheid was ruling at that time.
Great. And Luke, how about yourself?
I lived in South Africa from January 1990 to the end of 1994. I visit South Africa every year, so I've seen apartheid, I've seen the collapse of apartheid, and I've seen Africa since then.
Great. Okay. Guys, we're going to start the conversation in 1 second. Give me 10 seconds. 1 second. Okay, back. Sorry about that. Okay, so thank you for that background. What I'd like to just do then quickly, since we're talking about this conflict specifically, Stuart, would you mind just telling us what exactly got you so passionate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you can tie that directly with South Africa if you'd like, and then we'll go down the line again.
Okay, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a conflict I've been aware of ever since I was aware of anything really in terms of politics. At the same time, I was growing up and learning about South Africa, I was also learning about Israel and Palestine, and it's something that's always been in the news over the years. It's something that people I work with, I know Ronnie Casserol's fairly well. He's a very vocal critic of South Africa. He's, of course, Jewish, not practicing Jew, in South Africa, held a couple of ministerial positions as well. So, I mean, it's something I've grown up around, and particularly over the last few years, I think there was been a renewed focus on the whole thing really since 9/11 and looking at the whole question of the Middle East, the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, you know, all of those things have refocused attention that much only on what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And I think it's something that's well overdue to be resolved. It's gone on far too long.
Great. Norman, how about yourself?
What was the question exactly?
Just, was there anything specific that got you so passionate about the Israel-Palestine conflict and its relation to South Africa?
I don't think I'm particularly passionate about the connection between. In fact, I don't think I'm at all passionate about the connection between the two. I'm in a lot of forums and discussions in the South African context on Facebook, as I am in the Israeli-Palestinian process. South Africa, obviously, because I was born there, I still have an interest in South Africa in many ways. And as far as Israel is concerned, being in America, you know, that's a fairly common topic. I also have friends and relatives who live in Israel. So, and the whole thing, I think as far as Israel and Palestine is concerned, it is a troublesome thing, even from an American point of view, as much as it is, probably more so than from a South African point of view.
Great. And how about you, Luke?
Look, I've always been passionate about Israel. I was born in Australia originally, and I've lived in Australia since I've come back from South Africa. Australia's founding fathers believed in Israel, and I'm involved in a number of groups such as Australia United for Israel. But I see a very clear distinction between apartheid South Africa and in Israel, and I'm sure we're going to get into that in the discussion. But just if I can point out one thing, early on in 1961, Israel voted in the United Nations against apartheid South Africa and against the policy of apartheid. The Jews I knew in South Africa were very much against apartheid, overwhelmingly so. And there is a clear distinction, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
Right, exactly. So, Luke, why don't we, go directly into it? What do you see as some of those clear distinctions between the apartheid Israel that you know of and the apartheid South Africa that you lived in? What can you go over some of the clear distinctions you see?
Yeah, well, the first example, when I lived in South Africa, I campaigned quite strongly against apartheid, and in one particular instance, I actually received a photograph and a letter from Nelson Mandela for inviting young black people to a white-only swimming pool, which was against the law in the early 90s in South Africa. Now, in Israel, that never would have been an issue because Arabs, citizens of Israel, have full voting rights. They have right to live in Israel. There are ministers in the Israeli government of an Arab background. In South Africa, the blacks had no voting rights. It was a very different system. Israel is an inclusive democracy that doesn't discriminate on the basis of race or gender. South Africa very much did discriminate on the basis of race and was rightly condemned by the international community at the time. Whereas Israel's right to exist has been enshrined by the United Nations. going right back through the 1940s and earlier to the Balfour Declaration. So to compare Israel to apartheid South Africa is not something that can be based on facts.
Stuart, can you come in and address any of those items that that Luke just brought up?
Yes, certainly. Just to answer a couple of points directly, I mean, certainly many Jewish people were very much involved in the fight against apartheid. I knew a number of them personally, still in contact with them now. Almost all of them, I think I can say with confidence to a man or woman, would have been also quite strong anti-Zionists. So, I mean, there may be some, obviously, a whole range of views, I guess, amongst Jewish people, but that's my experience of the Jews I knew who were deeply involved, integral parts of the anti-apartheid movement. The other point, the relationship between Israel and South Africa, I wasn't aware of that vote in the UN. Perhaps that's because that's something of an anomaly. Israel and South Africa worked very closely together on a number of issues, particularly on defence-related issues, armaments, and South Africa was also implicated quite strongly in the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Israel. And these are pretty much established facts. To frame the debate, though, about about the similarities between the two and whether Israel is an apartheid state, I think we need to maybe define some terms and define how we look at the issue. Because to me, I'm not just looking at Israel within what is called Israel. To me, I look at Israel and the occupied territories, and I think that's an important difference. I think there are examples of discrimination within Israel itself, certainly in terms of who can and who can't build, and where they can and can't build, who gets a permit for building, who gets their house knocked down because they didn't have a permit for building, or some ancient land right is pursued through the courts and families are evicted. You don't see Jewish families being evicted from their houses in Israel, whereas that happens all the time to Palestinian families or Palestinian Israeli families. But I think if we look at the actual structure that apartheid operated in South Africa, there were two tiers of statehood, if you like. There was the overarching South African state, but within that were the Bantustans, which were at least ostensibly independent, or they were said to be independent. This was what apartheid was, separate development. And so within those Bantustans, you had leadership, you had kings very often. They were sort of African tribal cultures with different monarchs and what have you. And I mean, Botswana was meant to be an independent state. You had Transkei, you had Ciskei, names which you really don't hear in a South African context anymore. And of course, Lesotho and Swaziland, which were actually, to a degree at least, separate states. But that was how apartheid worked. So you had a central government to which whites only had the power to elect representatives, but then within that state you had other areas which were meant to be independent black states, right, or black territories, and people had no say then in the national government which operated over them. So my person would include Gaza and the West Bank, the equivalent to Bantustans, people who are effectively under the rule of Israel but have no democratic say in the government of Israel.
Right. Right, Norman, where do you come into this discussion on? Can you kind of give us your thoughts and feelings relating to whether you feel more in favor of Stuart or Luke's point of view, as well as what you make of the situation?
Well, I probably agree with both of them substantially. Let me just add the point about Israel voting against South Africa from an anti-apartheid point of view. It's sometimes one has to do things that are pragmatic. We all do. Politicians do it all the time. So history is never a good record necessarily without looking. I mean, if you went to see Lincoln, for example, you would have been. I was surprised But in any event, so yes, I think you have to make, as Stuart says, you do have, the troubling part of it all is the settlers in the West Bank. That to me is the key issue. I did ask a friend of mine who settled in the West Bank. He was a South African. He is South African. He now lives in Israel or in the West Bank. I don't know what it is. And he said, and I said to him, how do you justify that? Well, he said, well, you go back to the League of Nations, and in the League of Nations, they had a treaty. I've forgotten the name of the treaty, but essentially they said the Jews had the right to live between the Jordan and the Red Sea. So from my point of view, I think essentially the West Bank is an occupied territory, and it's been occupied, I think, from 73 possibly. That's a long time, longer than the America's been in Iraq. And it's a shame that hasn't been settled by now. Whether it's an apartheid system or not, that's a difficult one, because I don't think it's not Israel. South Africa had specific laws for the apartheid application, but on the other hand, the West Bank being occupied militarily, it's subject to military rule, and you know, that's a hard comparison to make. Israel should really, and Palestine should really get on with the job of settling the issue. Israel to get out of whatever it is Palestine is supposed to be, and that yes, they can have walls, they can have defensible borders. The Middle East is what the Middle East is. It's a dangerous place for practically everybody at some point or another.
Right. I want to get Luke. We'll get you back in here. And I'm sorry because you have the avatar on your face. So I don't know if you were maybe agreeing or disagreeing with some of the things that were said. But Stuart, quickly, I saw you shaking your head before. Was there something that you wanted to comment on that you were doing that before about?
There was something I disagree with, but it's slipped my mind now. All right. So I do carry on. Yeah.
No problem.
That's a good thing, Stuart.
Okay.
So quickly, in regards, Luke, in regards to what was tolerated and not tolerated in South Africa, can you go into like some specific examples, and then we can try and compare them, I guess, to what goes on in Israel? Can you give us a few examples of what could and couldn't be done, and then we'll see if those specific actions are applied in Israel and in these occupied territories?
Well, I'll give you one example. I have a friend who's from England who lived in South Africa. He married a Chinese lady from Taiwan, and he was frequently arrested during apartheid-era South Africa by the South African police. South Africa said that interracial marriage was illegal. He was harassed all the time by the police. In Israel, that's never been a problem. You can marry who you want to. As I said before, there's no discrimination on the basis of race or sex. And South Africa was very different. The Group Areas Act, we have in Israel, we have Arabs living in Jerusalem, Jews, people of all backgrounds. South Africa very clearly separated people according to their colour.
Luke, was there any?
If I could just make.
Yeah, go ahead, Luke.
If I could just also make one comment in relation to what Stuart said. He said before that Jews are never removed. What about Gush Katif about 6-7 years ago, which was a Jewish settlement in Gaza? All the Jewish settlers were removed from Gush Katif by the Israeli. That was another example of Israel's desire to exchange land for peace. Ehud Barak offered something like 90% of the Palestinian demands and offered a massive relocation of all Jews, not only in the West Bank, but Jews in other areas, and those demands were rejected by the Palestinian leadership. So that's another very different example of apartheid era South Africa. In apartheid, blacks and other minorities were frequently moved off their land so that white farmers and miners could carry out their activities, whereas Israel has consistently offered land for peace.
Right. So
very different.
Stuart, what? Yeah, go ahead and respond to that, to some of those things.
Yeah, and I'm aware that those people were removed. I think that's the factual part of what you said. I think to say that was an exchange of land for peace is not necessarily factual. I think that's an interpretation. My understanding of what effectively has happened was that those people were removed because it was expensive to try and defend them, and it also made it easier to isolate Gaza and saved any complications when attacking Gaza, that they might hit any friendly targets. It seems to have actually, since then, the separation of Gaza seems to have been cemented, and Gaza has become more isolated. In conjunction, they've taken a different tactic in the West Bank of building walls and separating people's communities. And the effect in Gaza and the West Bank for Palestinians is that they can't function economically, they can't function properly socially. These are people without a state. Israel doesn't allow them to become Israeli citizens. Israel doesn't allow them to even return to the places of their birth. Arabs in Jerusalem, if they leave, they're not allowed to come back, or it's made incredibly difficult for them to come back. I think you're kind of whitewashing and painting a much rosier picture than certainly what I hear of people who live there and the stories and the media reports that come out of that place. And I think one thing that we could perhaps discuss that would be interesting would be to discuss the similarities in ideology between Zionism and the ideology behind apartheid, because they're both supremacist ideologies. They both put the interests of one group of the population paramount and above the interests of everyone else. And I think that's another angle we can look at.
Right. Okay, so Norman, go ahead and share your opinion on any of the items that were just brought up.
Well, Zionism, that's a term that has become almost, it means something, whatever you want it to mean is what it means today. The truth is, Zionism has defined originally by Theodor Herzl and the people there was a desire to live back in what they felt these at the time Orthodox Jews was to go back to the biblical times of their home, which would be their homeland, which is Palestine. For example, when he was in his 90s, had lived all his life in Lithuania and decided, and then came to America, he decided he was going to die in Jerusalem. And that's the religious context in which you've got to look at it. Zionism today doesn't exist because there are 14 million Jews in the world. 7 million of them live in Israel. 7 million live in, or 6 million live in America, and the bits and pieces are scattered all over the road. Essentially, there are probably more people leave Israel, more Jews leave Israel than go to Israel today. Certainly, the American Jews, by and large, do not want to live in Israel. And the Israeli Jews, I think more of them would like to live in America, frankly, or Canada, possibly, or even Australia. So, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say even Australia. So, Zionism itself is an old word that I wouldn't use anymore, but it's used in a derogatory sense more than anything else.
Stuart, do you yeah, go ahead, Norman. Sorry.
Did I answer your question, Max?
Yeah, well, because what I was going to say is, I mean, Stuart, do you agree that the term Zionism, as Norman's claiming, is being used in a derogatory sense amongst certain individuals, and it's basically, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree it's used in a derogatory sense, but I think it deserves to be because of what it is. I mean, yeah, initially it was a desire for Jews to return to what they perceived to be, or what the Zionists amongst them perceived to be, as their historic homeland. The only problem with that, and there wouldn't be a problem with that, were it not for the fact that that land was already occupied, and in order to create that Jewish state, it needed a colonial type enterprise to go in there to establish Jewish enclaves, to fight a terrorist war against the British, who were in the occupying power, to get them to leave, and then to establish a state, and then to expand that state and to continue to basically ethnically cleanse the people who already live there. You know, the difference between a Jewish state and an Islamic state, for example, any of the other states which exist throughout the Middle East, is that those Islamic states are organic. They're made of the people who actually live there. They're not colonial enterprises where people have moved in, displaced the current population. Now, I don't agree with an Islamic state any more than I agree with the Jewish state. I'm a secularist, I'm an atheist. I don't think any religious, I don't agree with the Christian state for that matter. I'm a Republican when it comes to my own country, the United Kingdom. We have an official church. I don't agree with that. But there's a fundamental difference when you have people from outside coming in and displacing the local population, because that inherently means that people are putting their own rights as a community, as an ethnic identity, above other people. And that effectively is what happened in South Africa. If you go back far enough in history, that's something that happened in Northern Ireland and many others.
Great. Luke, do you want to respond to either of the things that were just addressed?
Yes, I think that Zionism has often been used in more recent times as a derogatory word, but I embrace the word Zionism. I don't think it speaks of supremacy at all. I believe it speaks of the right of the Jewish people to continue their presence in the Holy Land. The Jews have had its presence in Israel for the last 3,500 years, back to Abraham. There were Jews in Israel during the Ottoman Empire. There were Jews during the British administration of the Holy Land. There have been Jews all along. When Jerusalem was liberated by British and Australian soldiers back in 1917, the Jews of the city wept and embraced them. The Jews have always been there, and to say that Zionism is an invasion or is supremacy is akin to saying that native indigenous Americans are supremacist if they desire to have a continuous presence in North America. And the Jews have as much right to be in the Holy Land as anybody else does. They're embracing the Jewish state of Israel rather than being kind of a totalitarian picture that Stuart pictures, is tolerant of all religions, is tolerant of diversity. The birthplace of Christ, the places that are important to Christians and Muslims have been protected by the Jewish state of Israel. We see the mosque, which is situated on the site where the Solomon's third temple was, and these places are all preserved, they're all protected. So really, the Jews have always embraced everybody, and what is often missing in the arguments of those who criticize Israel are questions such as what happened to the 1 million Jews who were displaced from the Middle East, from Arab Muslim countries, when the State of Israel was brought back into existence. Where is the justice for these people? And just to throw another spanner in the works, lastly, the Palestinian identity of the Palestinians being a separate people from Jordanians and other Arab peoples, that was not really in common vogue until the late 60s, early 70s.
Right. So,
Okay,
yeah, go ahead, Stuart, and then I want to ask. Go ahead, Stuart, respond to that, and I'll ask a question of kind of all three of you that Nathaniel here in the text chat has asked. So go ahead, Stuart, and then we'll ask a question all three of you.
Okay. All right, yeah, there's 3 points I'd like to address there. The first, Jews have always been in Israel. Well, that to me is an argument against the necessity for a Jewish state. Jews have always been in Israel, and I don't think anyone would have or would have had any problem with Jews going back to Israel to be part of whatever state naturally formed after the end of the British Empire, but that's not what happened. Jews insisted on having a Jewish-only state. I mean, if you call something a Jewish state, then there's a reason for that, rather than just a state which includes everyone who naturally falls within those borders. If Jews had gone back to Israel or Palestine to live there as equals with the people who already live there, to integrate and become part of a mixed community, all with equal rights, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we are now. So to say that the Jews have always been there, I think is an argument to say a Jewish state defined as a Jewish state is simply not necessary when you've got a country which half of the population, well, more than half of the population, 85% around the 1940s, 1945 mark were Muslim, and then you had a substantial Christian minority there as well. And in the middle of that is set up a Jewish state. I think that speaks for itself. The other point about the Jews who went from the Middle East, it's often presented that there is a historic enmity between Jews and Muslims, and this is clearly not the case if you look back through history. This is something that's only happened since the foundation of the State of Israel. When Jews were fleeing Europe under persecution of the Nazis, they were restricted in numbers how many people could enter the United Kingdom. There was a restriction on the numbers of how many Jews could enter the United States. Britain and the United States were turning away Jews at this point, which, I think is scandalous. It's inhuman. A lot of these people were able to find refuge in the Middle East, where they were welcomed with open arms. There's no historic enmity there. Compared to the historic enmity between Jews and Christians, I think it's fair to say that Muslims have been far more welcoming and accommodating of Jewish people through the centuries than Christians ever have. What happened to those people who, it's true that many of them were pushed out of their countries. That was very much in Israel's interest for that to happen. Israel was looking for immigrants at that point. And I don't defend that happening, and if those people wanted to go back, then they would defend their right to go back. But as an anti-Zionist, I'm certainly not saying that Jews have no place in Israel. I think Jews have, and it should have, an equal place in Israel along with everyone else. So, that's all I'm saying. I certainly wouldn't welcome the expulsion of Jews from Israel. There was a third point, but I'll leave that for now.
Okay. What I was going to say is, Nathaniel asked, and I guess we'll have Norman answer this first. Norman, do you think there's any particular reason or claim to Israel as an apartheid state while not tackling the much worse situations that occur in other Islamic countries? Do you think that there's, some sort of unjust unfairness occurring with that?
Well, of course, that naturally comes up, and I'm glad we've gotten back to the topic, which is the subject of this discussion, which is the similarities or dissimilarities between South Africa and Israel. Because usually when we come down to it, we get back to who was there first and all that kind of stuff. So yes, I think that's first of all, it's crappy to be a Jew, quite clearly. That's number one. Number two, yes, I think Nathaniel's right, except that's not a topic for this discussion, because we're talking about Israel and South Africa. But it certainly seems to be unfair. You've got 60,000 people killed in Syria, all sorts of mayhem that's happening in Egypt. God knows what's going to happen in the rest of the Middle East as time goes by. It's really a dangerous place to be And if somebody had asked me, and who would have done that, I don't know, I would have suggested that the Jews really get a state like Nevada and settle there. But he's got a good point. It's just something that isn't part of this discussion for sure.
Right. Okay. So I guess one thing that I was thinking about when I was thinking about some questions to bring up to each of you guys, one thing that came across my head or came across my mind to bring up to you was the idea behind the Israeli military being in these occupied territories and having checkpoints and certain restrictions inside these areas. So what I wanted to get a sense from each of you is in relation to South Africa is like on the Israeli side you would probably hear them say we're not only securing our borders and our people, but we're also securing the Palestinian people from these militants and extremists. And so I wanted to get, and Luke, you can start. I mean, do you think that the idea behind the Israeli military being in these areas and quote unquote protecting both the Israeli citizens and Palestinian citizens, would you have seen any of that? One, do you agree with it? And then would you have seen anything like that inside of South Africa during apartheid?
Look, I certainly did see a lot of military activity in South Africa when I was there. The big difference, of course, though, is in South Africa, the South African Army and police during apartheid were combating people who were protesting for equal rights. Stuart was involved in the ANC, as he mentioned earlier. People who were involved in the ANC, that was a prescribed organisation at one time. So police and army were devoting their resources to frustrating the efforts of those who equal democratic rights based on colour. Whereas in Israel, Israel is a sovereign state. I don't really like the term occupied territories. I would prefer to say contested territories. Israel is very much open to a Palestinian state, but that has to be through direct negotiations. But in terms of a wall and in terms of is the Israeli army running checkpoints and other things, that's been a very necessary activity to combat terrorism. We all know of the terrible bus bombings and other terrorist attacks on Israel, particularly during the 1990s, early 2000s, the Intifada, Second Intifada, and there's been a significant drop in some of those activities since Ariel Sharon built the wall. And that wall is not a wall of apartheid, that is a wall to combat terrorism. It's not unlike, in some ways, unlike Belfast had a wall for a while to combat the activities of the IRA. However, as we saw in England under the leadership of Tony Blair, when the Sinn Féin was prepared to sit down and negotiate, they were able to get a lot of concessions. And Israel has been holding out the olive branch for the last 30, 40 years. 98% of offers to end the conflict have come from Israel.
Great. Stuart, go ahead and respond to any of that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are differences between Israel and South Africa. And certainly in South Africa, the security forces were very much a part of preserving the status quo of apartheid. And I think that's true in Israel as well. I think when you have a situation of extraordinary inequality, and when you have a situation where people are denied rights, basic civil rights in an extraordinary way, then you need an extraordinary military presence to preserve that. You know, the there's little left of Palestine to make a Palestinian state. The West Bank territories aren't even contiguous. They're crisscross, they're isolated from each other. Gaza is a tiny strip of land. I mean, the plan that Israel is now claiming leaves the Palestinian state to operate separately. Basically, these are open-air prisons or Bantustans. And I think if you're trying to preserve that level of inequality, then naturally people are going to resist that. And I mean, even South Africa used the same excuses, we have to fight terrorism, and if if the ANC comes in control, then white people will be pushed into the sea, there'll be genocide. All of those same excuses were there, and none of those things ever happened. I think when, Luke may say Israel offered the olive branch, it's offered an olive branch with very strict terms and conditions attached, such as recognising the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, when that's the very question that should be addressed to start with. You can't start negotiations sincerely with those kind of conditions on it. If you want to have negotiations, they should be unconditional negotiations and include all of the interested parties. So, you're asking people, the Palestinians, to concede the point before the negotiations have even begun, and don't think that's realistic, and I'm not surprised that it's failed.
Norman, is